And thank you for staying with us. A birth injury or a death of an infant profoundly affects any family. The loss or harm to a child changes the way people live forever when medical negligence is found to have caused the harm. Particularly, the feelings of sadness and anger can also become quite overwhelming. When the medical providers display negligence instead, the parent or injured party may wish to consult with a birth injury law firm. Recently, the Jacob Fuchsberg Law Firm just settled a landmark case in the Bronx involving a hospital that's actually destroying fetal monitoring strips, which were critical in evidence to a case. Joining us to share more in this is the managing partner of Jacob Fuchsberg Law Firm, Bradley Zimmerman. And Bradley, good to have you.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
It's an important topic to talk about when we talk about, the situations of birth injuries and then also deaths of infants. And I know particularly here in the borough of the Bronx, you pay particular attention. So talk to us a little bit more about this case.
Well, first of all, let me just say that when you actually, as a parent of, a newborn child, the expectation is during the course of the prenatal care and ultimately the delivery that the child's going to be healthy. And it's every parent's dream to have a healthy child, right? More than anything just about in the world. And so when that dream is not a reality, ultimately the parents are obviously very angry, upset, and have to deal with and have to ultimately use all of their costs, in other words, all of the money that they have, presumably to take care of this child for lifelong damages. And so what we do as attorneys, when parents come to us with these devastating injuries to their children, and some are catastrophically injured, some can't walk, some can't talk, some have cerebral palsy, some have strokes. What we do is we gather all of the evidence for them, and we look at all of the medical records, and we act as forensics detectives, and we try to determine exactly what went wrong in these circumstances. And one of the main records that we look at is the fetal heart monitoring strips, because the fetal heart monitoring strips basically demonstrate the heart rate of the baby as it's going through the labor process. And there are many stresses to the labor process, right? You have a first stage, and then you have a second stage, and ultimately the baby's delivered. And if mom becomes exhausted, baby becomes exhausted, ultimately the baby may lose oxygen. And because there's not a physician that actually decides to perform a C-section on time, many times those babies are delivered without oxygen and ultimately with cerebral palsy and the damages that flow from that injury, which are devastating. And so we as attorneys, we have to explain the procedure to the individual, the mom and the dad, exactly what transpired in the delivery or prenatal care that may have given rise to these injuries. And it's very important, therefore, that when a mom or dad go to the hospital for the delivery process, that they advocate for themselves. And if they're concerned about the fetal heart rate, if they see it going down, ask questions, make certain that you're there protecting the lives of your child. And remember, the doctors have a responsibility not just to mom, but to the baby as well. Both are their patients. So we as attorneys have to collect all of this evidence and make certain that what went wrong, they be held accountable for, the physicians, the hospital, the institutions. And what happened in the case, coming back to your question, is that these specific records from this Bronx hospital were actually purged and destroyed. And we recognize this because we ask for these records routinely. And the failure to provide those records was obviously a significant part of the assessment that we were going to have in terms of proving, by the way of evidence, what had transpired. And so, the court and New York State has a specific remedy for the failure to produce records, and specifically if they've purged or destroyed records, and that's either a negative inference that is instruction to the jury, basically saying that the jury can infer that the evidence that would have been presented had it not been destroyed is in the plaintiff's favor, the person bringing the action. And under that circumstance, the jury can actually find against the defendant for the failure to produce those records. And the threat in that case was that we were going to be moving and making a motion to strike their answer, strike any defense they had because of their failure to produce those crucial and important records.
How often do we see this happen? I mean, obviously, you're talking about a failure to produce records, destroy records in hospitals. From your work in this particular field, do we see this happen often?
You know, it does not happen as often as we used to see it. However, there are always those times and experiences that we've had along the course of our career that we've seen records changed. And, you know, there was just a recent case which came down where a doctor had actually discarded and destroyed her records after the litigation had begun. And in that case, punitive damages were actually asserted, and there was a finding of punitive damages against that doctor for the purging and destroying of those records. So even though in medical malpractice, it's usually very difficult to prove punitive or exemplary damages, in that case, the court was obviously felt that the evidence, and the jury believed that there was a preponderance of evidence that demonstrated that in that setting, the doctor actually should be made an example of in terms of monetary loss for actually discarding, purging, and destroying those records. So it does happen from time to time, but if it doesn't happen, you know, many times we'll see addendums to records where the doctors will attempt to memorialize what they believe happened after understanding that the child has been injured at birth. We've seen that many times. We've also seen doctoring of records in a specific case that I handled, where the doctor had written in a record that was written after the fact. And so we do see this from time to time. I'm not going to say it's the norm, it's not, but it does happen. One of the interesting recent advances in computer technology allows us to use what we call audit trails. The electronic records now have an audit trail that provide physicians, doctors, lawyers with a trail of who actually changed the record, right? And so we can, as attorneys, discover that information through requests for those audit trails, and we can determine who may have made, changed, altered those records in favor of the hospital doctor as opposed to the patient who we're most concerned about.
Yeah. Let me jump in. I got a couple of minutes left with you here. I wanted to talk to you about African-American maternal deaths. I understand that there is an increase in that. Tell us what you're finding and what can you bring to us?
Well, maternal death is one of the most awful experiences any family can have. And what we've seen since there was a CDC assessment in 2020, looking back in 2018, and throughout the United States, first of all, the maternal death statistic is 17.4 deaths for every 100,000 moms. So you can imagine that's a very, very large statistic. And, you know, in the United States alone, the United States is ranked, and you won't believe this, is ranked 46th among the countries of the highest rate of maternal death. So there are countries like Saudi Arabia, Portugal, and other countries that, you know, you wouldn't expect to be having a lower maternal death rate than the United States. And also, you know, the United States invests so much money in medical care, and the fact that we're down at number 46 is just, you know, unacceptable. And looking at specifically the African American community, specifically, you see that African Americans, in terms of maternal death, are dying at over 2 times the rate of white women. And that is, again, unacceptable. And specifically in New York City, it's up to even 4 times the rate. And so you can see that there must be, we ask ourselves, why is this happening? Why is this occurring? And this is the result of a systemic problem that we know that is in the community, and with respect to the care that's being provided. Doctors, physicians, hospitals have to do better for these patients. And now we have COVID-19, where we have another systemic issue and affecting that community. It's not acceptable. It can't be justified. And we have to make changes related to the care that we provide. Everybody in America is required to be provided accepted standards of care. That should be across the board. And when that doesn't happen, we see members of this community, members of the African community, dying, literally, because of these mistakes. And it's not acceptable. And we as lawyers, at the forefront of what we do is we're protecting the families by bringing these cases. and ultimately making a difference in their lives and hopefully making a difference in the care that's provided to this community.
Bradley, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing. Of course, we'll continue to monitor this and some of the other things that you talked about, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you in the new year.
That'd be great. Thanks so much for having me.
All righty, Bradley Zimmerman, our guest here on Open. Listen, stay with us. We've got more show. Don't go anywhere. We're coming right back right after this.